Welcome back to this introduction to Spring Boot. In this chapter 3, we're going to look at controllers and views. So in the previous chapter, we bootstrapped our Spring Boot project by using the initializer page at start.spring.io. And we've had a look at the structure of the project, and I hope you'll agree that it feels quite simple. We really just have one class called, for us, Fleetman application, which is clearly running some kind of bootstrapping, and it's using a magic annotation, which, well, I went into a bit of detail about how it works, but that effectively goes off and finds any controllers or services or repositories that we've written, and it will also create auto configurations for anything it finds on the class path. More information on that coming up later. But what I really like about Spring Boot is that it hasn't created any kind of project structure, and it hasn't generated any code, well, apart from the really one line of code you can see here. And that means that when we come to do our work, we're not really constrained in any way. There isn't a specific folder for controllers, there isn't a specific folder for domain classes, and so on. And this is a big difference to other similar frameworks like Grails or Spring Roo, where there is code generation and specific structures. The purpose of this chapter is to write our first controller so that we can get a web page up and running. And where do I start? Well, I just write a controller, as I would normally do in any Spring application. I can put the controller in any package I like. So as usual, I would make an architectural decision about where to put these things. I'm going to go for a package called controllers under com.virtualpairprogrammers. And I'm going to call this the first controller. And from here, we're now back to regular Spring. I know that you already know how to do Spring MVC, so just go and write a Spring MVC controller. I'm going to make a very basic one here with @controller. And I hope it's obvious, but just in case, this controller is a regular Spring MVC controller. There's nothing special about it. There's nothing bootified about it. And in here, I'm going to do a regular model and view method. Let's call this our first page. And for now, I'm going to do a request mapping. And I'll put a proper URL there. Let's go for home.html. And of course, model and view will need to be imported as usual. But now I'm just going to do a static page. So as you probably know, in the model and view class, I can return a new instance of it and just specify a view name. Now, what's that view name going to be? Well, for now, and I'm just going to annotate this, we will use a proper view resolver very quickly. That's because I'm going to do something very quick and dirty here. I'm going to hard code the path to the JSP page as the view name. As you probably know from Spring MVC, that's not a good way of working, but I will change that by the end of the chapter. So following good practice, I don't think we did this on the Spring MVC training course, but it's good practice to keep your JSP pages in the webinf folder, and that means they will not be visible if a user were to inadvertently directly navigate to that page. So that's quite a useful way of working. And I think we'll have another subfolder called JSP as well. And this is going to be called, let's give it a different name to the URL. Let's go for welcome.jsp. So that's a file that I need to create. And in a Maven structure, that's going to go into a folder called web app under the src main folder. So we'll create a new folder and find the parent folder, which will be src main, and the folder name is web app. And then into there, we'll add in a folder. This will be webinf/JSP. And then inside this JSP folder, we'll have a new file I've forgotten its name already. This will be welcome.jsp. In this chapter, we don't really need anything particularly dynamic, but I think just to prove that Spring MVC is working, we'll output the current date and time, and we'll pass that date and time across from the controller. So it'll be the usual business. So we'll create a model object in the controller called date and time. So very basic so far. We'll add that to the controller. And we're using here the java.util.date, and we'll pass that across as a model object, as you usually would in Spring MVC. Okay, all very basic so far, but of course we're just proving that the structures work. So before you run this, make sure that you've terminated your previous run, but as before, we can run this as a regular Java application. So the usual logging in the console, and the default logging level is info. And that means that the request mapper handling should be logging that the new URL we've created of home.html should be being picked up here in the log, and it's mapping onto the correct method in the controller. So we should be able to test this now. Now, one difference in Spring Boot is that there's no context root. So you might have been expecting to add in something like Fleetman and then our home.html. But that's not necessary here. We go straight to the URL, home.html. Well, we are still seeing the white label error page. And in particular, it's a status 404. As you already know Spring MVC, you'll know that this could happen for two possible obvious reasons. And the first one would be checking our controller if there was something wrong with the request mapping here. Well, it certainly looks okay. The home.html is matching the pattern that we added here. But I'd also like to draw your attention to the logging in the console here. One of the logs is the request handler mapping, and we're seeing that the /home.html has been mapped onto the method called first page. So I don't think it's that. The other possible problem would be if there's a typo here. So if you're following along with me, definitely check that you've got all of the spellings here correct, and that your folder in web app is definitely called web-inf, and you have a subfolder called JSP, and of course that you've spelt the file name correctly. Well, I have done that and everything's matching up, so I don't think it's that problem. And it turns out that this is a slightly rough edge on Spring Boot. I know you might have been expecting everything to be simple and wonderful in Spring Boot, and this problem may not apply to the version of Spring Boot that you're working with, but it certainly was a problem in version 1.3. The problem is related to using JSPs in an embedded Tomcat. So I can tell you that if we were to build a WAR file now from this, and then we were to deploy that WAR file to Tomcat, everything would work just fine. But the problem is that the set of dependencies that Spring Boot is automatically applying does not include a JSP compiler. Now, I have to confess that I don't know the deep reasoning behind this. I guess it's simply the case that, well, you only need the JSP compiler if you're running this as a jar file rather than a WAR file. So the upshot is, and I've only found this out by previous project experience of using Boot, but the first time I hit this problem, it would have just been a Google led me to the solution that we have to go into the POM file, into pom.xml, and of course, you know Maven, so you should know this, but just click on the pom.xml tab there. And we have to add in a further dependency to the dependencies list. Well, I realize now that I haven't really talked about the dependencies. You might have been expecting a great long list here, but actually there are only two dependencies. The first of them is the interesting one, I guess, the Spring Boot Starter Web. That was added through the initializer when we first created this application through that web page. As we go further through Spring Boot, we'll add further of these starters. Notice there's one there that came for free without us even asking for it for testing. But what we need to do is add in another dependency. And by the way, if you're using Gradle, then you need this dependency as well. Just to add this dependency using its group ID and artifact ID as usual. The group ID that you're looking for is org.apache.tomcat.embed, and the artifact ID is tomcat-embed-jasper. I don't know if you know, but Jasper is the JSP compiler that comes with Tomcat. So now we will need to terminate the server, but because we've added a new dependency, we need to make sure that it is added to our Eclipse build path. So we'll do that by running the eclipse goal again. And now if we refresh the project, it's worth having a look on the build path, configure build path. Under the libraries tab, you should now see in the list of jars there's an entry for Tomcat embed Jasper. So that's good. Let's run the application again. And now this time, I'm sorry that there was a little bit of pain there. You're going to find that Spring Boot is definitely not a silver bullet. It's really just a case of dealing with them. While we're here, there is a similar problem if we want to use the JSTL in our JSPs, and we probably do. I'm going to test this by using the C: for each tag to output a simple loop. And as usual, I'm assuming that you're well familiar with JSTL. I don't think we did exactly this on the Java web development course, but you can do the equivalent of a for loop by using begin and end. Now, of course, to make this work, we will need the taglib declaration at the top of the JSP. I've just copied that in from another JSP that I have lying around. If you want to do the same, you can borrow that from the practicals and code folder. So if we stop and restart the server, in fact, I'll show you in a few moments that it was probably not necessary to do that. If we now go back to our page and refresh, well, yeah, we're back to the white label error page, slightly different this time, and it is a bit more understandable, this one. It is saying that the taglib, effectively, is not being found. And that's because, once again, the JSTL is not part of the dependencies in the starter for a web application. So one last addition that we will need to make to the POM file is the standard dependency that you use for JSTL. So you might be familiar with that. The group ID is javax.servlet, and the artifact ID is just JSTL. Again, we will definitely need to stop the server. We'll rerun the eclipse goal, refresh the project, restart the application, and then checking in the browser. Yeah, that's good. We're now getting that loop working. By the way, I think the reason why JSP isn't directly supported in a Spring Boot web application is the default assumption is that you will use an alternative view technology called Timeleaf. I don't know if you've come across Timeleaf. It's been growing in popularity quite dramatically over the last few years, and it is exactly what I've just said. It's an alternative replacement view technology that is, well, frankly, a lot better than JSP. And more Spring projects are using it. And I'm sorry that we haven't covered it so far on any virtual pair programmers course. We will get around to it at some point, but actually we are going to do an advanced Spring Boot module after this course has been released, and I am planning to include Timeleaf as part of that. But at least that's given me a chance to show you how to get a standard JSP style web application up and running in Spring Boot. I'm sorry it's slightly awkward, but it's really just two Maven dependencies to add. If you make a change to your JSP, let's just change the length of the loop. I'll change it to 5, and I'm going to save, and I'm not going to restart the server. It's worth mentioning that now if we refresh, the changes to the JSPs will be picked up. Unfortunately, until we do something a little bit cleverer, if we make a change to the controller, let's be very brutal. I'm going to not send date and time anymore. If I do a save there, that will recompile that class. But back to the browser, I'm still getting the date and time because unless we make some adjustments, I am going to have to stop and restart the server to make that change take effect. So there we've lost the date and time. I'm going to show you how to get around that problem, but I think that's one of the best things on this course. So I'm going to keep that in reserve for a little while longer. That'll be in a couple of videos' time. If you're familiar with Spring MVC, you will know that it's a pretty bad practice to use a hard-coded file name in here like I'm doing. For all the reasons that I've explained on the Spring MVC training course, we might want to rename this file, we might want to use a different type of view. I can certainly imagine a time when we changed the JSPs for an alternative view technology like TimeLeaf that I mentioned before. And it's better if in here, rather than hard-coded file names, we have a more generic so-called view name. So we might say in this example that we want to render the view called welcome, and then we'll supply a configuration to tell Spring MVC how it should handle that view. And Spring MVC does that by using a so-called view resolver. Well, the most commonly used view resolver is the internal resource view resolver, which simply takes the view name that we've supplied and it adds to the front a prefix and to the end a suffix, and it then searches for a file matching that pattern. And because that's done in configuration, that means it's a very easy thing to do to switch, for example, from JSPs to something like TimeLeaf. You would just change the configuration. So it's a very elegant system. Well, the important thing is to say that Spring Boot has already configured a view resolver, and a view resolver has been in use throughout this chapter. It's just that the built-in prefix is blank and the suffix is blank as well, but it was working. And we don't have to touch the configuration of that view resolver. We can simply go into the application.properties file, which we'll find under the resources directory. Now this is a regular Spring properties file. It's currently blank by default, but that internal view resolver will look up a prefix and a suffix as long as it's referenced by spring.mvc.view.prefix and spring.mvc.view.suffix. Just in case you're supporting any old Spring Boot projects, up until something like version 1.3, it was just spring.view.prefix and suffix. They've added this .mvc to make it consistent with other properties elsewhere in the framework. And then we simply supply colon and then the prefix that we want to apply. So for us, this is web-inf/JSP/, and for the suffix, well, this is going to be .jsp. So very easy to change the view technology without having to change and recompile all of the controllers. But there is another little problem with the way that we're running within Eclipse. Let's stop the application and start it up again. And I think you will find back in the browser that, yes, we're back to the white label error page. Now, the reason for this error is a Maven-related problem. If we have a look on the build path, under Configure Build Path, and then click on the Source tab. Now, this configuration here has come directly from the Maven Eclipse plugin. And the Eclipse plugin has specified that the resources folder should be on the build path. And that really means that everything inside there, including application.properties, will be copied across to the classes directory at runtime. But if we have a look inside here, now I must admit I don't fully understand the reasoning behind this, but certainly on this version of Spring Boot, there's an exclusion in there. And the exclusion is saying that application.properties needs to be excluded from the build path, which means when we're running here locally as an embedded application, that file is not being copied across. Now we do need it to be copied across, so I think you'll find if you just click the remove button, so select excluded and then click remove, and then we'll click terminate, and I think we need to force a rebuild, so project and clean should do the trick there. So now that application properties should have been copied to the correct directory. Let's run the application again and back to the browser, and that's great. That is now being picked up. So it's really just a minor clash really between the build path that we're using when running Maven externally and when we're running inside of Eclipse. Now that's not really a proper solution, because if I click terminate, of course at some point we're going to change the dependencies in the POM file and we will want to run the Eclipse Maven plugin again. And the trouble is now the Eclipse Maven plugin is going to rewrite that build path, including the source folder. So now if I refresh and go into build path and then configure build path, oh no, if we have a look, that exclusion pattern has been added back in. Incredibly annoying, and we really don't want to have to go in and remove that every time we run the plugin. There is a fix that we can apply directly in the pom.xml. So let's go back into there. What I'm going to show you here is just what I do on my project, and it works for me. It might not be the best way of fixing it, but as I say, I've had no problems with it. We need to find the existing build tag in the POM. And inside the build tag, there's a plugins tag, but we're going to add a tag directly underneath build called resources. And under resources, there's another tag, resource. And then inside there, we have a filtering tag set to true. We have a directory tag, which is going to reference our resources directory, which is src/main/resources. Notice there's no forward slash at the beginning of that path. And then we have an includes tag. Now this isn't the best fun we've ever had. And inside here we have an include. We're going to put in here application.properties. And when you go a little further with your Spring Boot, you will see that you can also use a YAML or a YML file for these properties. And if you did that, you would want to add that in here as well. So there's another awkward little trap. Let's see if that works. If we run the Eclipse plugin again and refresh. Again, check the build path on the source folder. This time around under resources, we have application.properties on the includes list and not on the excludes list. And I hope now, make sure your application's terminated. If we run it up again, yeah, the page is still responding. So I'm sorry about that. I know you were expecting for a Spring Boot course everything to be very simple and almost automatic, but there are a few sharp corners, and what I'm trying to do with this course is to get the sharp corners out of the way nice and early. One other problem that you might have had, and this was true of the version I used to record the course, 1.3, I can't believe this will be a problem for much longer in Spring, because it's such an annoying little trap. And it's cost me many hours on a previous project, is that in the properties file, Spring does not strip away the white space, which means if you leave a space at the end of the line there, then Spring will leave that blank space in there and it will ruin your URLs. Let me prove that. And back to the browser. Yeah, we have a 404. Now that we know what's going on, it's fairly obvious because it's trying to give us the file name that it was trying to render. And you can see a gap in there. I hope you can anyway. But I hope you can see that if you were not aware of that, that could be a very difficult error to debug. As I say, I'm fairly sure that this will be fixed by Spring soon, and it might not be present in the version that you're using. But in any case, do make sure whenever we work with application.properties for the rest of this course, make sure that you're not leaving any stray spaces lying around, because they will do you some harm. With that pain out of the way, I want to remind you the real thing that we've done in this chapter. We've written a regular Spring MVC controller. If you know Spring MVC, then writing the controller is trivial. And of course now, okay, we had a little bit of awkwardness, but now that's out of the way, you could go ahead and write as many controllers as you like, really quickly, really simply, with zero configuration. Of course, this isn't really a professional controller yet. We're really going to need to add a domain layer to the application, and we'll be doing that in the next chapter.